On paper, Iga Swiatek starts the 2026 season with a clean slate, a five-time Grand Slam champion, cleared in a high-profile anti-doping case, and once again the face of women's tennis. In reality, her entire year now hangs over a phrase buried deep in the WTA Rulebook, a phrase that gives the tour extraordinary power to punish players not just for what they do on court, but for how they make the sport look. That phrase is bringing the game into disrepute, and behind closed doors, lawyers and agents are already warning that this vague clause could be weaponized against Swiatek if she pushes back too hard against the system that almost ruined her career. According to the WTA's own statements on her anti-doping case, she was sanctioned for a contaminated medication, found to have no significant fault, and given a 1-month suspension that overlapped with a provisional ban she had already served. Yet the message players took from that saga was not relief, but a warning. If this can happen to the most powerful woman in the sport, what happens to everyone else when the tour decides your words or actions damage its image? The WTA's 2025 rulebook and its updated safeguarding code read like any modern sports regulation document, full of technical language about integrity, protection, and respect. They lay out detailed expectations for professional conduct and appropriate behavior from players, coaches, and other participants, and they repeatedly stress that the WTA has the authority to discipline anyone under its jurisdiction who violates those expectations. At first glance, that sounds reasonable. Tennis needs tools to deal with abuse, harassment, match fixing, and genuinely harmful behavior. But tucked among the pages that spell out on-court code violations and safeguarding rules is a familiar, elastic concept that sports organizations have relied on for decades: the catch-all power to sanction conduct deemed detrimental to the sport, its reputation, or its stakeholders. That language is rarely front and center in promotional materials, yet it sits there in black and white, giving the WTA the right to decide when a player has crossed an invisible line. The tennis public usually sees only the visible part of this structure: the fines for racket abuse, audible obscenities, or unsportsmanlike conduct that umpires announce during matches. Fans share clips of a smashed racket or a shouted curse, then move on when the match ends. But the real leverage sits off-court, where the WTA can open disciplinary cases under broader behavioral and safeguarding provisions, refer matters to integrity bodies, and quietly impose conditions, suspensions, or fines when it believes a player has harmed the sport's image. Under these codes, a player's public statements, social media posts, press conference comments, and even private interactions with staff or officials can become evidence in a conduct case. Once a matter is framed as disrepute or conduct detrimental to tennis, almost anything that makes the organization uncomfortable can be pulled into the net. To understand why this matters for Iga Swiatek's 2026 season, you need to look at how the WTA already polices players in less dramatic ways. In recent seasons, top women have been effectively forced into crowded schedules by strict mandatory event rules that tie ranking protection to appearance quotas at WTA 500 tournaments. Public coverage has documented how Swiatek and Aryna Sabalenka both faced ranking point deductions when they failed to meet these requirements, with Swiatek losing points after skipping events in Asia even when she cited personal reasons or overload, and Sabalenka also falling short of the minimum number of 500-level events. The rule is simple on paper, but brutal in practice. If you do not play enough mandatory tournaments, the ranking system inserts 0-point penalties and deletes some of your previous results, effectively punishing you twice. Those sanctions are technically about participation, not disrepute, but they show the same logic at work. The WTA is willing to manipulate ranking math to enforce its commercial and calendar priorities, even when players argue that the rules are strict, stupid, or illogical in interviews and social media posts. For Swiatek, this did not happen in a vacuum. She has spoken openly about the madness of mandatory rules, the strain of constant travel, and the emotional toll that comes with trying to peak for Grand Slams while fulfilling every obligation the tour demands. When those comments are combined with her status as a global star, they stop being just personal grievances and start sounding like a critique of the entire system. That's where the disrepute idea becomes dangerous. If the tour is already prepared to hit its biggest star with ranking penalties for missing tournaments and to watch her endure months under an anti-doping cloud before a finding of minimal fault, nothing stops it from leaning on broader conduct clauses the next time she challenges its authority. The same rulebook that insists on the importance of safeguarding and integrity also gives the WTA considerable discretion to decide when a player's words or actions damage its brand. The official rulebook language usually frames this power around the need to maintain integrity and protect participants, and the safeguarding code reinforces that certain forms of abuse, harassment, or false reporting will themselves be treated as violations. But because these clauses are written in deliberately broad terms, they can stretch to cover public criticism, pointed comments about governance, or even player-organized protests that sponsors or tournaments see as bad for business. In other sports, references to bringing the game into disrepute have been used to sanction players for calling out corruption, refereeing, or leadership decisions in terms that make the league uncomfortable. Tennis is not immune to that pattern. Recent reporting on online abuse campaigns against players and on the way governing bodies coordinate their responses has already shown how sensitive the sport is to anything that might destabilize its image with broadcasters and fans. When image becomes the priority, it's not hard to imagine the WTA treating Swiatek's criticism of schedules or processes as something more than just honest feedback. Swiatek has already shown she's willing to speak bluntly about governing bodies. After months of uncertainty around her anti-doping case, she described how much money and emotional energy it took to clear her name and how little control she had once the process began under the International Tennis Integrity Agency's authority. She had to assemble her own expert team, commission independent analyses, and wait while outside laboratories and disciplinary panels decided whether her future would be defined by a positive test from a contaminated medication.
The WTA, for its part, acknowledged the ITIA decision and highlighted that the substance came from a regulated medication and that she bore no significant fault. But it did not take public aim at the system that sidelined its star for weeks before a final ruling. That asymmetry matters. When a player criticizes the process or the institutions involved, she is effectively criticizing entities that the WTA works with every day. The more outspoken Swiatek becomes about workload, anti-doping procedures, or governance transparency, the more tempting it is for officials to remind her that she operates under codes which require respect and prohibit behavior that could be framed as harmful to the WTA environment and its participants. Agents and lawyers who work in this space know the pattern. A frustrated player vents about leadership in a press conference, a senior official bristles. Suddenly, there are quiet conversations about whether those remarks crossed a line, whether they might discourage sponsors, whether they could be interpreted as undermining confidence in the sport's integrity. Once that question is asked, the disrepute clause is sitting there on the page, waiting to be applied. The safeguards that supposedly protect whistleblowers offer another glimpse into how narrative control and conduct policing intersect. The WTA's safeguarding code explicitly includes whistleblower protections, promising confidentiality and bans on retaliation against those who report abuse in good faith. On paper, that should encourage players and staff to come forward when they see misconduct. But the same document warns that intentionally false reports can themselves be treated as violations, feeding into the same discretionary apparatus that governs disrepute. That creates a chilling effect. A player considering a public statement about how she was treated by officials, or about bullying, harassment, or integrity issues inside the tour has to weigh not only the risk of being disbelieved, but the threat that her own comments could later be cast as harmful, misleading, or damaging to the WTA's reputation. When the person in that position is Iga Swiatek, whose every word drives headlines and social media storms, the pressure to stay within an invisible line becomes enormous. So what would it actually look like if the WTA decided Swiatek had crossed that line this season? The most obvious pressure point is the ranking system. Just as mandatory event penalties quietly reshuffle points without the drama of on-court violations, disrepute or conduct findings can lead to fines, suspension of benefits, or conditions on participation that never get spelled out in press releases. The WTA's rules allow for a range of sanctions, depending on the severity of the conduct, from financial penalties to suspensions from specific tournaments or parts of the calendar. In practice, that might mean a suspended suspension hanging over Swiatek's head, to be activated if she repeats behavior the tour considers unacceptable. Another avenue is safeguarding and integrity referrals, where cases can be opened under confidentiality and resolved with negotiated outcomes that leave the public none the wiser. A player might agree to certain restrictions or undertakings to avoid a formal public sanction, effectively accepting a form of probation. Sponsors and tournaments also play a role. A Grand Slam or major partner unhappy with Swiatek's public criticism can push privately for action, knowing that the WTA's codes give it flexibility to justify a response under the broad umbrella of protecting the sport's image and participants. In a year where she is already managing the physical and emotional load of returning from a suspension, defending ranking points under the mandatory calendar, and maintaining her position at the top of the game, even the hint of a conduct case would be enough to destabilize her season. Every press conference would feel like a balancing act between honesty and self-protection. Every social media post would be vetted not just for tone, but for how it might be interpreted by lawyers reading the word disrepute in the most expansive way possible. The real problem is not that the WTA has codes against abuse, harassment, or genuinely damaging behavior. Those protections are necessary, and the safeguarding code's detailed list of prohibited conduct around emotional, physical, and sexual misconduct reflect serious attempts to address real harm in the tennis environment. The problem is that those same documents sit alongside and sometimes blur into vague standards about reputation and disrepute that are never clearly defined for players or fans. When you combine that with a fragmented governance system where anti-doping enforcement belongs to one agency, safeguarding oversight to another structure, and ranking and scheduling power to the WTA itself, the result is a fog of rules that can be selectively enforced. Swiatek's recent experiences, from her provisional suspension and one-month ban over contaminated medication to the ranking hits tied to mandatory events, have already shown how easily an athlete's season can be reshaped by decisions she does not control. There is also a broader context that makes 2026 especially volatile. Tennis is in the middle of a digital and commercial expansion, with the WTA promoting its social media reach and video views as proof that women's tennis is a premium global product. In that environment, the image of stability and integrity becomes a selling point. Governing bodies are more sensitive than ever to anything that looks like internal conflict, corruption, or player rebellion. When Swiatek questions the logic of mandatory rules or describes the emotional cost of fighting an anti-doping charge she insists came from a contaminated medication, she is not just telling her own story. She is highlighting structural weaknesses in the very product the WTA is trying to sell. That makes her the tour's greatest asset and a potential liability. For now, there is no public sign that the WTA has opened a formal disrepute or broad conduct case against Iga Swiatek. What exists instead is a climate of fear and ambiguity where star players know that speaking too loudly about calendar pressure, double standards between tours, or the opaque handling of integrity in safeguarding cases could invite retaliation through channels the public never sees.
Fans watched how long it took for her anti-doping situation to be resolved, and how the final narrative still emphasized the authority of the system that investigated her rather than the flaws that allowed a contaminated medication to derail her season. If Swiatek chooses to test the limits of that system in 2026 by calling out governance failures or demanding more transparency about how rules are enforced, the WTA's hidden disrepute clause may become the most important line of text in her career. The question is whether the tour will use it to protect the integrity of the game or to protect itself from its players.